My name is Avon. I'm 34, and I recently figured out my blood relatives had assigned me a market value. I never agreed to the appraisal. The afternoon I lost the most lucrative restoration bid of my entire career, my younger sister didn't bother asking if I was holding up okay. She just wanted to know who was going to float her lease payments now. My mother sat there sipping iced tea, nodding as if a delayed SUV payment was a global tragedy. Meanwhile, my father shuffled into my old bedroom, grabbed a plastic storage tote, and began dropping my heavy flannel work shirts into it. He mumbled something about my sister needing the square footage more than I did. They had absolutely no clue what I had spent the last 3 years building 4 hours north in the mountains, or whose signature was actually on the deed to a secluded A-frame cabin perched on 40 acres. What played out over the subsequent month dismantled their comfortable little setup brick by brick. You're listening to Blood and Balances, where dependable people finally stop acting like structural support columns for families who only notice them when the roof sags. Hit subscribe, and let me drag you back to a miserable Tuesday in late October. I own a contracting firm called Timber and Truing. We salvage historic post and beam barns and century-old timber structures that rot and gravity have tried to ruin. Snapped load-bearing beams, waterlogged mortises, that's my daily life. I built it from scratch with a rusty pickup and a lot of splinters. So when my primary investor called to back out of a massive Heritage Lodge restoration, I didn't shatter. A third of my projected annual income evaporated before lunch. I sat in my drafting room in Ridgeville staring at the ledger. Then, I just shut the laptop. I rebuild bonds that have been collapsing for 50 years. I could rebuild a busted quarter.
The money wasn't what made my stomach turn. What bothered me was knowing I had to keep the loss to myself. Mostly because no one in my family actually understood what I did for a living. They vaguely assumed I hammered nails for a local builder. It was easier to let them think that. That same afternoon, I made the grueling 4-hour drive south to Oak Haven, the suburban sprawl where I grew up. I'd been spending 4 nights a week in that house for a little over 14 months. My dad suffered a severe stroke the previous summer. I packed up half my life and moved back into my teenage bedroom to manage the fallout. I kept my actual career running in the mountains and babysat my family's dysfunction in the valley, burning up the highway between them. When I finally parked on the cracked concrete of their driveway that evening, 2 unfamiliar vehicles were blocking me in. My Uncle Vance's rusted flatbed and the obnoxious yellow hatchback belonging to my sister's latest boyfriend, Julian. In our household, unexpected guests on a weekday meant a verdict had already been reached in my absence. The heavy oak front door hadn't even latched behind me when my sister's voice echoed down the corridor. "So Dax told Julian you lost your job." Sloane was curled up on the love seat, scrolling on her tablet. Julian slouched next to her. My mother, Lenore, occupied the velvet armchair. Old Mr. Henderson from next door was lingering near the kitchen island with a plate of crackers, clearly thrilled to have front row seats to the drama. "I didn't lose a job," I said, dropping my keys into the bowl. "A client's funding fell through." Sloane didn't care about the nuance. She immediately pivoted to my mother, acting like I was invisible. "Mom, how am I supposed to pay the lease on the hatchback?" There it was. No rough day, just immediate panic over a bill. My mother set her iced tea on a coaster, interlacing her fingers. It's a specific posture she adopts when she's already drafted the script and just needs everyone to read their lines. "Now, Avon, don't raise your voice. We'll figure it out. You always figure things out." Julian let out a quiet, mocking laugh, eyes glued to his phone screen. Uncle Vance leaned against the hallway doorframe, shooting me a glance I couldn't quite decipher. It looked vaguely like pity. "How do you even know about my client?"
I asked, genuinely annoyed. Sloane rolled her eyes. Julian's buddy works at the lumber yard. People talk. So they'd known since noon. They had convened a town hall in the living room to dissect my financial stumble before I even crossed the county line. The sole item on their docket was who was going to float Sloane's $400 car payment. I drove 4 hours just to find out my own relatives held a board meeting about my bank account, I muttered. My mother gave me that tight, placating smile usually reserved for toddlers. Just sit down, Avon. You're overreacting. I stayed standing. My father, the exact same hands that once taught me how to read a tape measure, were now abruptly evicting me from the house I had basically been keeping out of foreclosure. You're actually doing this? I said. You've always landed on your feet, my mother called out from the living room. She said it like it was an undeniable law of physics. And there it was, the core family philosophy. Avon lands on her feet, which conveniently means nobody ever has to bother trying to catch her. I stared at the plastic bin. Resting right on top of my clothes was my great-aunt's heavy brass compass, the one she gave me when I turned 10. I reached down, grabbed it, and shoved it into my pocket. My fingers brushed against a heavy metal keychain I had never bothered explaining to anyone under this roof. I had no intention of explaining it now. You aren't kicking me out, I said, keeping my voice dead level. I'm choosing to leave. My dad finally paused, looking up at me. For a fraction of a second, he looked ashamed. Then my mother yelled, "Stop being so dramatic!" And he immediately went back to tossing my clothes. I grabbed the bin myself, hauling it up against my hip. I walked out the front door before anyone could fake a polite goodbye. I drove the entire 4 hours back up to the mountains that exact same night, the plastic bin sliding around in the bed of my truck. I didn't shed a single tear. I was entirely too occupied running calculations in my head. By the time the highway began to wind upward and the crisp pine air hit my open window, I already had the next 30 days mapped out. My apartment was a cramped studio above a hardware store in Ridgeville. My workshop was a massive converted aircraft hangar 2 miles away, bearing a sign I had welded myself. This was my actual life, untouched by them. My business partner, Maeve, was still at the hangar at 11 o'clock, which was her standard routine whenever a big job collapsed and we needed to pivot. She glanced at the plastic bin I was carrying and raised an eyebrow. You finally walked away from that place? She noted, tossing her safety glasses onto a workbench. They walked away from me, I corrected her. I just stopped fighting the current. Maeve had spent the last year begging me to cut the cord with Oakhaven. She had watched me drain my savings, transfer cash to cover their utilities, and grind my truck's transmission to dust driving that highway. She had watched me return to the shop looking hollowed out every single Monday. Fantastic, she said, leaning against a stack of reclaimed oak. So, what's the play? I didn't give her an answer immediately. I dropped the bin onto my desk. Tucked at the very bottom, buried under old invoices, was a manila envelope I kept locked up and transported back and forth like a classified dossier. Maeve spotted it. Is it time to open that? She asked quietly. I hadn't been sure before, but for the very first time in 14 months, the exhausting tension I'd been carrying just vanished. The rope simply... When Sloane decided she desperately needed a reliable vehicle, but her credit score was an absolute disaster, my mother slid the dealership paperwork across the kitchen counter. I co-signed, fully aware that a repo on her end would destroy the commercial credit I relied on to buy lumber for my business. I didn't do it to play the saint. I did it because I am fundamentally incapable of watching a structure collapse when I possess the tools to brace it. That is my fatal flaw. I reinforce things. I'd rather carry the dead weight than waste breath arguing over whose mess it is. I genuinely believed it was a temporary fix. I even tried laying down ground rules. Sloane takes over the payments in 6 months. I told my mother the afternoon I signed the loan. My mother just waved her hand dismissively. She's just finding her footing. Sloane never found her footing because no one ever let her experience gravity. I was the one who supposedly defied gravity, which was just their polite way of saying I was the one they never had to worry about. I made that exhausting drive every single week, lying to myself that blood ties were worth the friction. People always ask me the exact same question when I tell this story. Why is your mother so obsessed with your sister? It's complicated. Before I was born, my mother lost 2 pregnancies late in the 2nd trimester. She refuses to speak of it, but my great-aunt Beatrice explained it to me years ago. 2 empty nurseries, and then Sloane finally showed up. Premature, terrifyingly tiny, but breathing. My mother fundamentally reorganized her entire existence around shielding Sloane from the world. Along the way, she subconsciously categorized me as the indestructible one. I grasp the psychology behind it. Understanding the math doesn't make the resulting bruises hurt any less. My father had his own baggage. He grew up terrified of a fiercely abusive dad.
Arthur learned very early in life that survival meant immediately agreeing with whoever was shouting the loudest. In our house, that person was Lenore, so he never advocated for me. He just avoided eye contact and packed up my belongings when instructed. The only relative who ever actually saw me was my great-aunt Beatrice. She used to pull me into the kitchen when I was a kid and whisper, "You aren't the tough one, kiddo. You're just the only one who bothers showing up." She lived in the converted sunroom of the Oakhaven house now, turning 82 next month. Her entire existence was confined to a knitted blanket, a recliner, and the television. She had lost her own independence decades ago, and it broke my heart. Honestly, she was the primary reason I endured that highway for so long. I didn't do it for my mother. I did it for the old woman in the sunroom who still asked about my day. That first night back in Ridgeville, I decided I was more than willing to absorb one financial black eye if it meant permanently closing a 15-year tab. Finally, I grabbed a notepad and listed every single household expense I had been secretly floating for them. I took a thick black marker and crossed a brutal line through every single item. It took me barely 40 minutes. By the time I finished, the invisible scaffolding I'd erected around their lives had been completely removed. They had kicked me out just after dinner. By 2 a.m., the ground beneath their feet had already begun to crumble, and they were completely oblivious. I wasn't acting out of malice or trying to be vindictive. I did it because a load-bearing beam had finally detached from the house, and a beam cannot support a ceiling it is no longer connected to. I finally unsealed the manila envelope I had brought back from the valley. Inside was a property deed I had signed 3 years ago, listing my name as the sole owner of a gorgeous A-frame cabin tucked into 40 acres of untouched mountain forest. I had kept it a total secret. Not a word to Sloane, Lenore, or Arthur. I ran my thumb over the embossed seal on the paper, the way you trace the edges of a winning lottery ticket. Then I locked it back in the drawer and turned off the lights. The reality of a failing structure is that it rarely collapses all at once. First, a single invoice goes unpaid. Then a final notice gets taped to the door. Then a phone rings in a suburban kitchen 4 hours away, and a woman who has never balanced a checkbook in her entire life suddenly realizes she has no idea what keeps the rain out. Some people call me ruthless for what I did that night. Maybe I was, but I had spent over a year generating heat for a house that only kept other people warm. If you've ever been the foundation for a family that ground you to dust, you know how I felt. The fallout is up next. For 48 hours, the Oakhaven house went completely dark. No passive-aggressive text messages from Lenore, no awkward voicemails from Arthur.
Sloane did upload a heavily filtered photo of my old bedroom to her feed, captioned something profound about finally getting the creative sanctuary I deserve. I didn't engage. I just threw myself into the wood dust. That's my default setting when something cuts deep. I bury the hemorrhage under a brutal punch list. Maeve and I hustled to secure smaller, faster contracts to plug the financial crater the lodge project left behind. We braced a collapsing silo and sistered the rotting joists of a wraparound porch that was one bad thunderstorm away from flattening. It was exhausting, honest labor, and the checks cleared immediately. On the morning of the third day, my cousin Dax called. Dax was the only relative who didn't speak in riddles or expect me to float his bar tab. "Hey," he said, sounding deeply uncomfortable. "Thought you ought to know. A certified letter arrived at the house today. Official bank stationery. Lenore has been staring at it since breakfast." "What kind of letter?" I asked, wiping sawdust off my forehead with the back of my glove. "Something about a home equity line of credit being past due?" She looked absolutely terrified even. She kept asking Arthur how to fix it, and he just kept pacing. A block of ice dropped into my stomach. "What home equity line?"
Sloane had the absolute nerve to call me later that afternoon. I almost sent it straight to voicemail, but some pathetic, ingrained reflex made me swipe answer. That tiny, stupid hope that maybe someone actually wanted to check on my well-being. "Hey," she chirped, completely bypassing an apology. "So my auto insurance draft hits on Monday. Can you just transfer the funds? Oh, and Mom says the furnace is making a weird grinding noise, so we'll probably need you to cover an HVAC tech too." No greeting, just a demand ending in a $sign. "Sloane," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Do you comprehend where I am right now? I'm 4 hours away, and I am permanently off your payroll." A pause. I could hear Julian muttering something aggressively in the background. "Don't act like this," Sloane whined. "You always handle the maintenance stuff." "I handled it because the rest of you refused to. That doesn't make it my inherent responsibility. I'm not your ATM, Sloane. I never was." Julian's voice spiked in the background. "Just ask her about the other thing," he snapped. Sloane immediately shushed him, but the damage was done. "What other thing?" I demanded. "Nothing," Sloane said. Maeve read the cutoff text the next morning while pouring her coffee. She gave a sharp nod of approval. "Zero wiggle room," she noted. "They are going to paint you as an absolute monster for this." "Let them," I replied. "I've been holding up the walls for over a decade. They can try carrying the roof for a month." I meant it too, but I knew Lenore's playbook inside and out. She wouldn't argue about the routing numbers. She would weaponize the concept of family. She'd twist a basic financial boundary into a devastating betrayal because guilt was the only currency that had ever worked on me. The retaliation hit just before lunch. Lenore called 7 times in a row before I finally picked up. She didn't lead with the revoked car payment. She went straight for the jugular. "After everything this family sacrificed for you," she spat, "this is how you repay us?" "And what exactly did this family sacrifice for me, Lenore?" I asked. Dead silence. She couldn't list a single thing. Instead, she fell back on the classic defense. "You always land on your feet, Avon. You don't need us the way Sloane does. Why are you trying to ruin her life?" "I'm not ruining anything. I just stopped paying her bills." Then came the manufactured sob. "I lost 2 babies before her, Avon. You have no idea what it feels like to almost lose a child." It was her ultimate trump card. I drove back down to the valley 2 days later, entirely bypassing the front door. I slipped through the overgrown side gate that led directly to the sunroom, avoiding the living room where Lenore and Arthur were undoubtedly lurking. Great Aunt Beatrice was swallowed by her oversized recliner.
a knitted afghan pulled up to her chest. She looked significantly more fragile than she had just a week ago. But the moment I walked in, her eyes lit up like I had brought the sun into the room. "There's my favorite girl," she rasped. I pulled a wooden stool close and took her hand. Her skin felt like dry parchment. We chatted about the stray cats in the alley and the terrible soap operas she watched. Eventually, she stared out the smudged glass of the dreary suburban street. 82 years on this earth," she murmured. "What do you want for your birthday, Bia?" I asked softly. She gave a sad, wistful smile. "I only ever loved one place in my whole life, Avon." I sat on the dusty floorboards for hours, staring at that handwritten list until the mountain air turned freezing. She'd sealed that tin inside the drywall the very year they built this place. It sat in the absolute dark through the foreclosure, through 4 decades of careless buyers, because no one had ever bothered stripping the structure down to its original bones until I bought it. I folded the paper back into the rusted tin. I knew exactly what my next move was. I walked out onto the massive cedar deck I had built with my own hands, the pine trees swaying in the twilight, and dialed my attorney. "I need to establish a life estate," I told her, my breath pluming in the cold air. "For my great-aunt. She gets exclusive rights to live in the cabin for the rest of her life. No rent, no hidden clauses. I retain the deed, but the property is legally hers to occupy until she passes." My attorney confirmed it was bulletproof. It was the exact type of ironclad legal maneuver that my family couldn't manipulate, because the asset was entirely mine to surrender. I had purchased this A-frame at a county tax auction using money I bled for. Now, I was going to hand the keys back to the only woman who had ever treated me like a human being. I decided right then. I was hosting Beatrice's. The booking inquiry for the A-frame was submitted by Lenore Sims. I practically stopped breathing. My mother had gone online looking for a picturesque mountain venue to host Beatrice's birthday, something that would look appropriately expensive for her social circle. And the algorithm had served her my property. She had absolutely no idea it belonged to me. More importantly, she didn't even recognize it as Beatrice's lost cabin. The listing photos showcased the extensive modern renovations I'd done. It looked nothing like the dilapidated shack the bank had seized in the 80s. Maeve leaned over the drafting table, reading the screen. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "She is literally trying to pay you to rent the house she doesn't know you own to host the party you are already planning." "In the exact house her own aunt lost," I added, my voice tight. The sheer irony was suffocating. The woman who looked me in the eye and said my sister deserved a roof more than I did was currently attempting to hand me a deposit for a roof she didn't know I possessed. A part of me wanted to reject the booking with a savage text message. "You can't rent what I already own." But a text message is cowardly. Lenore hadn't humiliated me in private. She had tossed me out in front of the nosy neighbor. I wasn't going to settle this over a digital screen. I was going to detonate this bomb in person, with a catered buffet and witnesses. "Leave the request pending," I told Maeve. Before we could finalize the trap, my phone rang again. It was Dax, and he sounded physically sick. "I figured out what the bank letter was," he said quietly. "You need to sit down." 2 years ago, Lenore had secretly taken out a massive home equity line of credit against the Oakhaven house to fund Sloane's lifestyle. Because Lenore's credit was garbage, she needed a solvent cosigner. She had kept my financial records from the car loan and forged my signature. The HELOC was in default. The house was collateral, and my name was legally on the hook. I didn't lose my mind. Panic is a luxury for people who don't understand how load-bearing structures work. I called my attorney, Sarah, first thing the next morning, and we treated the entire disaster like a contract dispute. We methodically stripped it down to the studs. We pulled the original loan documents from the county clerk. We laid the signature on the HELOC application right next to a copy of my actual driver's license. The forgery was glaringly obvious. We cross-referenced the dates Lenore supposedly signed the paperwork in person with my GPS logs from the mountain job sites. Then we handled the miserable, tedious paperwork. I filed a formal fraud dispute with the lender, signed an identity theft affidavit, and walked into the county sheriff's office to file a police report against my own mother. Sarah gave it to me straight. This is a solid fraud claim, Avon, but bank investigations take months. They aren't going to just magically transfer the debt to your parents overnight. The goal right now is proving you aren't legally liable. Once the forgery holds up, your name comes off, and the bank goes after the people who actually spent the cash. I sat in her office, putting it in writing that Lenore had committed a felony to fund Sloane's lifestyle. A year ago,
Then I set the trap for the birthday party. I had Maeve reply to Lenore's booking inquiry through the Timber and Truing corporate email. My name was nowhere on the correspondence. The email simply confirmed the A-frame was available for the requested date and mentioned an event coordinator would handle the gate codes. Lenore, absolutely thrilled to find a location that would look expensive on her social media, wired the deposit without a second thought. She never bothered asking who actually owned the property. People like Lenore don't care who poured the concrete. They just enjoy dancing on the floor. So, the entire extended family was heading up to the mountains, to my cabin, to celebrate Beatrice's 82nd birthday, and nobody had a clue whose deck they'd be drinking on. I let them book it. I just omitted the ownership details. You are seriously going to let them set up a catered event in your living room, fully believing it's a weekend rental? Maeve asked, staring at the confirmed invoice. I am going to let them walk through the door believing Lenore pulled off a miracle, I replied. And then I am going to tell the exact truth in front of everyone whose opinion she actually cares about. That was the entire strategy. Lenore trafficked in public humiliation. The plastic bin, the nosy neighbor, the secret meetings. So I would respond with public truth. I wasn't going to scream or throw a tantrum. I was just going to state the facts in a room full of witnesses, stripping away her ability to twist the narrative into a story where she was the bleeding victim. I spent the next 14 days obsessing over the cabin. I sanded and stained the cedar deck, touched up the exterior trim, and carved a heavy wooden plaque that I hung right next to the front door, though I kept it draped under a canvas drop cloth for the time being. The venue was locked in. Beatrice didn't know, Lenore didn't know. The only people clued in were me, Maeve, and a real estate attorney drafting a very specific life estate. Arthur called me the Tuesday before the party. He never calls me. I almost let the phone ring out when his name flashed on the screen. Avon, he muttered, followed by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. It was the exact kind of suffocating quiet he used to fill the house with when Lenore was yelling. I know that night wasn't handled right. The plastic tub, I shouldn't have packed up your work clothes. I just waited. I had waited over a year for him to string together a single honest sentence, and I wasn't about to interrupt him now. Your mother insisted it was best for everyone, he continued, his voice thin. I just went along with it. I always go along with it. I guess that's my defining trait. It is your defining trait, Dad, I said. I didn't say it to be vindictive. It was just a fact. He let out a long, shaky exhale. A certified letter showed up. Something about the house and a bank loan. Your mother refuses to tell me what's actually in the envelope. I rubbed my temples. Ask her, Dad. It's her loan. She claims your name is on it. It is. She forged my signature without asking. The line went dead silent for so long I thought he had hung up. I genuinely didn't know, he finally whispered. I believe you, I told him. You never know anything that happens in that house. The consequences of my boundaries started detonating in Oak Haven later that week. Dax narrated the entire collapse over the phone, completely unprompted. The hatchback went first.
A flatbed tow truck idled up to the driveway on a Wednesday afternoon and hooked Sloane's car while she stood on the front lawn in her pajamas, screaming at a repo guy who was entirely unfazed. The loan was 90 days past due, and her silent ATM had officially shut down. Now, she was forced to ride shotgun in Lenore's sedan like a grounded teenager. Then, the fraud dispute letters from the bank hit the mailbox. With the account frozen and my income removed from the equation, the lender aggressively targeted my parents. The fraud department started asking Lenore highly specific questions about IP addresses and notary stamps that she couldn't answer. They demanded the missing funds. Lenore called Dax, sobbing hysterically about what Avon is doing to this family. Dax, absolutely refusing to play along, told her flatly, Aunt Lenore, Avon didn't borrow a dime of that money. She immediately hung up on him. Julian, clearly sensing that the free ride was over, started making excuses to avoid the house. All talk of an engagement ring magically stopped. I felt a very complex knot in my chest watching the wreckage from 4 hours away. It wasn't happiness. It felt more like watching a badly framed roof finally cave in after you spent years warning the owners about the snow load. I didn't push the roof down. I just stepped out from under it. "Are you holding up okay with all this drama?" Dax asked me over the phone. "I'm fine," I said. I immediately cringed because I'd used that word as a shield my entire life. Actually, I corrected myself, I'm significantly better than fine. For the first time in 15 years, the thing cracking under the pressure isn't me. Dax let out a low chuckle. "Save me a good seat at the party," he requested. "Front row. I want to see this." I told him he was one of the few relatives who actually earned an invitation. I basically lived at the A-frame during the final week leading up to the birthday. I finished sealing the deck boards and scrubbed the massive windows until the glass was virtually invisible against the tree line. Maeve helped me string heavy bistro lights through the pine branches. The caterer sent over the final menu, including a massive blackberry tart, which was Beatrice's absolute favorite dessert. The heavy wooden plaque I had carved remained hidden under a drop cloth near the entrance. The cabin didn't look anything like the rotting shell my family vaguely remembered from the 80s, and it certainly didn't look like a generic corporate rental. It looked like a home that someone had painstakingly dragged back from the brink of death. I stood out on the cedar deck the night before the party, watching the fog roll through the valley exactly the way Beatrice had described in her hidden note. I brought the rusted metal tea tin out with me. I placed it carefully on the stone mantel inside, propping the faded Polaroids against it, with her handwritten bucket list still folded safely inside. A part of me really wanted her to discover it on her own. The legal deed was tucked into a leather portfolio in my truck, fully notarized, with the life estate paperwork clipped securely to the back. Every single piece was in position. Lenore genuinely believed she had rented a high-end venue. Sloane thought she was just attending a free catered lunch. My aunts and uncles were driving up from the city, and not a single one of them knew that the property they were about to drink wine in had been salvaged by the daughter they threw out like trash.
Lenore called me at 8 in the morning on the day of the party, and her usual theatrical performance was finally showing actual cracks. "The bank is threatening to foreclose on the house, Avon." Her voice trembled. For the first time in my life, her panic sounded genuine. "They claim the HELOC is in default. They said you filed a police report for identity theft. You need to call them and fix this. You have to help us." "I didn't take out that line of credit, Mom," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You forged my signature." "I did it for your sister, for this family," she shrieked. "You did it without my consent, and now you expect me to cover the felony. We could lose the Oakhaven house." "You looked me in the eye and told me Sloane needed that house more than I did," I reminded her, my voice dead calm. "So I left it entirely to her. I am literally just doing what you asked." A thick, suffocating silence hung on the line. Then she defaulted to the exact same phrase she always used, like a worn-out record skipping on the turntable. "You always land on your feet, Avon. You can handle a credit hit. We can't." I let the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. "I'll see you at the party, Mom," I said finally. "I think you'll find the venue is really something." She completely missed the underlying weight of my words. She was entirely too consumed by her own fear and anger, convinced I was acting like a monster. "At least you're bothering to show up for your great aunt," she stacked. There it was again, the absolute audacity to imply I was the one who ever failed to show up. I ended the call and finished loading the remaining supplies into my truck. I grabbed the leather portfolio holding the deed. I drove the winding mountain roads with the windows rolled down, breathing in the sharp pine air. I felt more stable than I had in a decade. Today, the truth was going to stand up in a crowded room.
I arrived at the A-frame 2 hours before the invite time to run a final walkthrough. The catering staff was already setting up heavy oak tables on the grass clearing below the deck. The bistro lights were primed for sunset. Inside, the faded Polaroids rested quietly on the stone mantel next to the rusted tin. I double-checked the leather portfolio. The life estate document was flawless, with Beatrice Eleanor Vance typed boldly across the header. Maeve walked out onto the deck, handing me a bottle of water. "Are you absolutely positive you want to do this in front of the entire extended family?" she asked. "They are going to make it incredibly toxic." "They already made it toxic," I replied. "They did it in a living room, in front of a nosy neighbor, while handing me a plastic bin. I am just responding in the exact same format they established." Maeve nodded slowly. "So, what's the actual playbook?" "No grand speech. I'm just going to let Lenore do what Lenore does. She will take full credit for booking the cabin. She'll perform for my uncles. And right when she is standing in the center of the deck, completely convinced she has won, I will state the facts. Then, I give Bea the keys." Maeve studied my face. "And the rest of the family?" "They find out they are just temporary guests," I said. "Not owners, not entitled heirs, just guests. Because Bea loves them, and today is about her. But that heavy door I've been cropping open for 15 years, that slammed shut today." I wasn't even angry when I said it. That's the detail people never seem to grasp. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't mentally rehearsing vicious comebacks. I was just profoundly calm. The first vehicle started crunching up the gravel driveway just after 2 o'clock. I smoothed out my jacket, grabbed the portfolio, and walked down the stairs to greet my great-aunt. Everyone else was irrelevant. Arthur wheeled Beatrice up the paved incline in a rented transport chair, a thick wool blanket draped over her lap. I watched her face the entire way up. She was squinting at the A-frame, the way you stare at a familiar face you can't quite place. Then, the massive cedar deck came into full view. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the stone chimney, the exact angle of the roofline. She stopped breathing. Her trembling hand flew up to cover her mouth. "Arthur," she gasped, grabbing my dad's sleeve. "Arthur, this is..." She couldn't even finish the sentence. "This is my house." My uncles and cousins were walking past her toward the open bar, completely oblivious. But my dad froze. He knew this cabin. He had spent his childhood summers running around this exact property. He stared at the restored timber, and then he slowly turned his head to look at me, standing at the top of the stairs. An expression of sheer, unadulterated shock washed over his face. Lenore came marching up the pathway in an expensive floral dress, already flashing her host smile for the relatives. "Isn't it absolutely stunning, Aunt Bee?" she loudly announced, making sure the entire yard heard her. "I found it just for you. I demanded a venue with a view." Beatrice ignored her entirely. She was staring at the heavy wooden plaque I had hung by the front door. I had finally pulled the dropcloth off that morning. It read, "Beatrice's Ridge," carved deeply into the wood. "Who did this?" she whispered, tears spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "Who brought my home back to life?" The party chatter buzzed around us, ice clinking in glasses, cousins laughing. But in our small radius, time stopped. Beatrice was weeping, my dad looked pale, and Lenore finally began to sense that the script in her head wasn't matching the reality of the room. "Bee?" Lenore laughed nervously. "I rented it for the weekend. It's a corporate rental." That was the exact moment I had been waiting for. I walked down the wooden steps. Lenore, clearly rattled but desperate to maintain control, did what she always does. She filled the uncomfortable silence with her own voice.
She pivoted toward the cousins gathering by the buffet and projected her voice into the role she craved most, the generous matriarch. "I wanted B's 82nd to be unforgettable," she announced loudly. "So I tracked down this gorgeous mountain estate. It wasn't cheap, let me tell you, but family deserves the best." A few relatives clapped politely. Sloane, standing near the cooler, smirked as if the praise belonged to her. Lenore was practically glowing. The terror of the morning's bank foreclosure warning was temporarily buried under the warmth of an audience. The woman who coldly told me my sister needed a bedroom more than I did was now taking a theatrical bow on a deck she didn't realize I owned. 3 months of planning, she lied. I just wanted a place that felt like home. Beatrice was still staring at the wooden sign. Arthur hadn't moved an inch. Dax, standing by the fire pit, caught my eye and gave a subtle nod, like a man watching a tsunami roll in. I let Lenore have her moment. I let the lie inflate. I let her gather the crowd into her manufactured narrative, absolutely certain she was the hero. Then, when she paused to let the admiration sink in, I stepped squarely into the center of the grass. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. "Mom," I said, my voice carried clearly, "you didn't rent this cabin." The yard went instantly silent, like someone had pulled the plug on the volume. Lenora turned to me, her fake smile slipping. "What do you mean?" "Of course I did. I wired the deposit to the management company." "Timber and Truing is my company, Mom," I said flatly. "The one you booked through, the one you paid. And this is my cabin." Nobody moved. The cousins snapped their heads back and forth between us, instantly realizing they had walked into a minefield.
"I bought this cabin 3 years ago," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level so the facts could speak for themselves, "at the county tax auction. It was the exact property Beatrice and Uncle Ray lost when the interest rate spiked. The bank had let it rot. I drained my savings account to the absolute bottom and bought it outright. I've been driving up here every single weekend since to rebuild it with my own tools." Lenore's mouth hung open. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. That's impossible. You do manual labor. You work construction," she stammered, clinging to her old assumptions like a life raft. "I own a heritage restoration firm," I corrected her. "I have owned it for 6 years. You never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living, because you only ever cared about what my paycheck could do for you." When the ground drops out from under Lenore, her default defense mechanism is pure rage. She erupted. The polite, wealthy hostess facade completely evaporated, and her face flushed dark red. "You secretly bought our family's property and hid it from us?" she screamed, not caring that my uncles were standing 10 feet away. "You let me stand up here and make an absolute fool of myself? After everything we did for you? After we put a roof over your head? This is how you get your sick revenge?" The relatives stood frozen, watching her meltdown. I didn't raise my voice by a single decibel. I didn't have to. The louder she screamed, the more pathetic her narrative sounded. "This isn't revenge, Lenore," I said quietly. "It's just the truth. And it is about time the truth got to stand up in a room where you couldn't manipulate your way out of it." I turned my back on her, walked over to Beatrice's wheelchair, and dropped down to one knee. I held the leather portfolio out. Every single pair of eyes on the lawn was watching us.
"Bea," I said softly, ignoring the heavy silence pressing down on the yard. "I brought your mountain house back, and I am not just letting you visit it for the afternoon." I unsnapped the portfolio and pulled out the legal deed, pointing to the life estate clause at the top. "This legally guarantees you reside here for the rest of your life. Nobody collects rent. Nobody sets rules. The morning fog on this deck belongs to you. Exactly the way you wrote it down. The way you sealed it inside the drywall 50 years ago for me to eventually find." Her hands trembled violently as she reached for the thick paper. She read the legal jargon once, squinted, and read it a second time. Then she pulled the document against her chest and let out a sound that absolutely shattered me. A breathless, broken cross between a laugh and a sob. "My deck," she whispered. "My own house. I'm home."
Lenore suddenly found her voice again.
For the very first time in my existence, Lenore had absolutely nothing to say. The carefully manicured illusion she had spent decades building collapsed right there on the grass, in front of the exact audience she was desperate to impress. Aunt Martha, who never possessed an internal monologue, chimed in loudly from the buffet table. "Lenore, what is this business about a fraudulent bank loan?" Lenore flinched violently. Of course, the family gossip mill had already caught wind of the HELOC disaster. The cousins immediately started whispering. Sloane, sensing the spotlight shifting in a dangerous direction, tried to play the victim. "This is completely unfair," she whined. "You are deliberately embarrassing us at a birthday party." "I'm not embarrassing anyone," I replied. "I'm just stating facts in public. There is a massive difference. You would be amazed how often those two concepts get confused under your roof." Julian had already backed away toward the gravel driveway, suddenly hyper-focused on scrolling through his phone. He was pulling the classic exit maneuver of a guy who realizes the bank is closed. And then Arthur finally moved. My dad, who had spent 64 years staring at his boots and packing up boxes when instructed, stepped directly past my mother. He walked over to Beatrice's chair, placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, and looked at me. "She's right." His voice was gravelly and strained. "Avon is right about every single bit of it." It wasn't a grand monologue. It arrived about 3 decades too late. But Lenore whipped her head around to look at him as if he had just stabbed her. This time, he didn't avert his eyes. He didn't cave. "Lenore," he said, his tone absolute. "Enough." It was the first time I had ever witnessed him cut her off. The party didn't violently explode. It just unraveled.
The crowd thinned out quickly as the evening cooled. Relatives left in awkward pairs, though a few deliberately stopped to squeeze my shoulder before heading to their cars. They looked at Lenore very differently on the way out. Sloane eventually walked down the driveway with Julian, but she marched back up 10 minutes later because he had literally driven off with her. She didn't offer me a real apology. She just sat on the bottom stair for a minute, staring at the tree line. "I didn't know she took out that loan in your name," Sloane muttered. It wasn't much, but it was the first honest sentence she had spoken to me in a decade. Then she climbed into Arthur's sedan. My parents drove back to Oak Haven to face a crumbling household they would have to salvage using their own paychecks and their own credit scores. The fraud investigation regarding the HELOC would drag on for another 6 months, and the outcome was entirely out of my hands. But I was no longer carrying the bag. Whatever documents Lenore signed, she would have to answer for. I stayed behind with Beatrice. Once the final taillights disappeared down the mountain road, I wheeled her chair over to the railing. We sat in silence as the sun dipped behind the pines, throwing dark orange light across the valley. She kept the deed clutched in her lap. "First sunset that actually belongs to me," she murmured. "Only took 82 years. "It's yours now," I told her. "Every single one from here on out." She reached out and gripped my hand. We watched the light fade together, without saying another word, because nothing else needed to be said. I kept the A-frame, and Bea lived there. I drove up most weekends, just like I used to drive to the valley, except now the highway led to someone who was genuinely happy to see me, instead of someone who just needed my wallet. Timber and truing bounced back. We landed 2 massive commercial contracts by November, easily covering the hole the lodge project left. You fill the holes by doing the work.
Lenore and I didn't speak for a very long time. I never bothered to officially slam the door in her face. I just stopped using my own spine to prop it open. Arthur called me occasionally, brief, incredibly awkward conversations. Once, he actually drove up to the mountain completely alone. He sat on the cedar deck with Bea and me, drinking black coffee, and barely spoke. For him, sitting in comfortable silence was a massive leap forward. People who hear about this often ask if I feel a lingering guilt for cutting off my own blood. I usually tell them what I finally figured out the hard way. Family is not a recurring invoice you are obligated to pay until you die. It is a doorway.
And I am completely done holding it open for people who only ever ring the bell when they want to take something out of the fridge. The people who show up just because they love you, you will always let them inside. The rest of them can figure out how to patch their own roofs. I spent over a decade acting as a load-bearing wall. It turns out I make a much better front porch. If there is a single thing you take away from my experience, let it be this. Establishing a firm boundary is not the same thing as locking your family out in the cold. It is simply deciding who actually earns a key. That is the whole story. A canceled contract, a plastic storage tub full of work clothes, and a mountain cabin a family tried to claim from the woman who had already saved it. If this reminds you that your generosity is not a permanent debt, consider this your wake-up call. Issue yourself the first key.